And I think it was the first time that I've ever had an introduction where I thought halfway through, as you told the story about Richard Beeston, I'm going to burst into tears. I'm actually going to go on stage, and I'm already crying at a speech that I'm not giving, but that you're introducing. So thank you, Dean Cara, thank you very much. Thank you, Director, thank you to the University of Navarra. For all of those in Pamplona, hi. We're all going to be working for you one day, so remember us. We're fans of yours. And to the Rafael del Pino Foundation, thank you so much for hosting me and all of us tonight. I once came out of a speech. It was a British politician's speech, and we got together with the main journalists, the leader writers of the Times, and we were having an argument about what the speech was about. What was it really about? And one of the leader writers said to me he thought it was about an hour. And I know that sometimes when you look back at a speech, you say, what was it about? You say it was about an hour. I'm going to try and speak for about 40 minutes, and then I hope that we will be able to have really as open a conversation as possible. I love the theme and the spirit of this endeavor by the University of Navarra, the idea that we should be open and discussing the future of journalism, the future of media, and the future of the society we live in. So with that, I'm going to start the speech. Like all good journalists, I started with a question and then changed it. So I tweaked, I hope if you don't mind, from a title that was the future of freedom of expression, or freedom of expression in the internet age, to something more cryptic: the valley and the hill, technology, democracy, and the future of free expression. In 1984, a good place, I hope you'll agree, to start a discussion on the future of freedom of expression, Apple Computer ran an ad on Super Bowl Sunday. Years later, as many of you who know it will attest, people still talk about it. But in case you haven't seen it, let's start just by taking a look at it. I hope Jose can run it.
Today we celebrate the first glorious anniversary of the information purification directives. We have created, for the first time in all history, a garden of pure ideology, where each worker may bloom, secure from the pests of vain contradictory thoughts. Our unification of thoughts is more powerful a weapon than any fleet or army on earth. We are one people, with one will, one resolve, one cause. Our enemies shall talk themselves to death, and we will bury them with their own confusion. We shall prevail.
On January 24th, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh. And you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984.
The personal computer promised freedom. Not just liberation from the computer systems of IBM, but untold possibilities of personal expression. Tonight, I'd like to talk about what that freedom looks like now. Because it's obvious that the freedom of expression we've got isn't exactly what was advertised. We have, if you like, human zombies who've been unleashed from the mainframe but now lashed to their mobile phones. And the internet age is proving to be like other revolutions, morally messy. Like no other revolution, it has empowered the individual. It's hastened the exchange of ideas. It's accelerated our capacity to fix problems and improve lives. But very much contrary to expectations, it has not just redistributed power, it has concentrated it in very few hands. And increasingly, it appears that we have been emancipated from industrial drudgery only to find ourselves in a digital dystopia. Truth, mental health, neighborliness, democracy, all struggling to cope with the challenges posed by what's happening on the small screen. The question before us is, what are we going to do about it? How are we going to make the internet work for society? And the truth is, we're struggling to answer that question. And what's more worrying still is that's the easy question. This question has two parts. The first part is making the digital media work for us. The harder part, the second part, is going to be making artificial intelligence work for us. But let's be clear, the issues we are facing now are just the dress rehearsal for the arguments to come. When and whether to regulate, what behavior to encourage, which incentives and which prohibitions to put in place. This evening, I'd like to talk about what should happen in the relationship between technology and government, between Silicon Valley and Capitol Hill, between the valley and the hill. I'd like to talk about the metrics that we should begin to ask of those valley companies. I'd like to talk about the kinds of regulation that politicians in London and Madrid, Washington and Brussels should consider, and the interventions, the creation of new kinds of public space in the internet age. We should set out, I think, in a spirit of radical optimism. And I feel that way particularly keenly at a place such as this, on an evening such as this. It is an exceptional honor to be a guest of the University of Navarra, which has had such a long and meaningful commitment to journalism and the modern communications industry, a place that I have to say I'm rather intimidated by, has quite such an illustrious roll call of journalists to its name. I believe that this is the most exciting time to be a journalist since the advent of television. That the internet enables us to gather information, to tell stories in ways that were far beyond our imagination just a generation ago. I also think it's an important time, a consequential one for journalists and for journalism. We need to speak truth to power, particularly when power is proving that it likes to talk back, or perhaps I should say tweet back. When politicians and demagogues are looking to marginalize journalism, when authoritarians are deciding what their citizens should know, when the noise of the digital age is muffling the news, this is a time for journalism. More than ever, we need journalism that speaks for the people and takes a stand to the powerful. For all the eyes that now exist in the digital devices we use today, it's a time when, strangely, so much is going unseen. We all look, once again, to reporters. And I look at a school like the University of Navarra, with its students here in Madrid and you in Pamplona. And I believe this is exactly the kind of place with both the energy and the expertise that has the ability, and I should say the responsibility, to shape the modern media and the society we're going to live in. Personally, I find myself in an exciting spot too. Until last month, which I note ended yesterday, until last month, I was running BBC News, which across the UK and around the world, in radio, in television and online, in English and in nearly 40 other languages, employs just over 8,000 people. Today it's just me. I'm launching a new kind of information and ideas business, but in case anyone is expecting a big reveal, or worse still, a pitch, I'm not going to be talking about my startup tonight. I'm not ready to do that. As you may have realized, today marks the very beginning of my very first month working on it. So I hope you'll give me a little time, and I hope that the students in Pamplona will have me back one day when I'm up and running to talk about it. Instead, I want to talk about the news, and the digital world that we're all facing, the future of freedom of expression in the internet age. I once asked Richard Gingras, many of you may know him, he runs news at Google. I asked Richard, what did he think was the future of news? He paused, thought deeply, and said, more news. And indeed, the future of free expression is more free expression. The unstoppable fact of my working life has just been that there's more and more and more stuff. When I started at the FT, I guess we produced a couple of hundred stories a day. By the time I got to the Times, daily papers, along with their 24-hour, 7-day-a-week websites, were producing about 400 pieces a day. I arrived at the BBC to discover that we produced 4 seconds of news for every second of the day. And it turns out we were only barely competing. Look at the volume that we're competing with now. The numbers I'm going to quote now are a little out of date, but they give you a sense of what's happening in our times. Every minute on Facebook, there are 510,000 comments posted, 293,000 statuses updated, and 136,000 photos uploaded. On Instagram, for example, there are 95 million photographs and videos shared every day. Before we go any further, I'd just like to say that the vast majority of this is for the good. Technology is a force for love. It's no accident that this is the greatest period in human history for love. It's easier to love who you want, to share photos and messages of people you love, to be comforted by others in grief or loss, to find the things you cherish, all thanks to these powers of technology. Technology is a force for joy. Life's funnier. We wouldn't have had the mashups of Donald Trump lip reading. You wouldn't have had some crazy lady in a car park wearing a Chewbacca mask laughing hilariously. You wouldn't have had a little boy sitting in a car telling a monkey on the roof where he thought the monkey on the roof should go. You wouldn't have had the wonderful moment at lunchtime one day on the BBC News, a sage, no doubt wise pundit talking about the future of the Korean Peninsula, only to be interrupted by his kids and then his wife trying to salvage a live moment of television. And all his professionalism brought us to this day no greater wisdom about the Korean Peninsula, but we laughed. Until the internet, we didn't know that cats could skateboard, and now we know that they're unfeasibly good at it. Technology is a force for justice. The exchange of information, the empowerment of the individual and of the individual author is tackling injustice more than any one newsroom ever did. Think of Black Lives Matter. Think of Me Too. Think of I Paid a Bribe. How easy might it have been to dismiss, underestimate, or entirely ignore the abuse of power had it not been for the power of free expression in the internet age? And technology is undoubtedly a force for progress. Tom Friedman, the New York Times columnist, I think brilliantly charts the achievements of this age of accelerations. We have witnessed in these last 50 years the most successful period in the history of our species. Life expectancy up, literacy up, infant and maternal mortality down, death in conflict hugely down. And indeed, it is worth putting things in some historical context. If you listen to the Yale historian, Tim Snyder, he makes the point that innovations in the media have always been accompanied by great ruptures in society, often very bloody ones. We think of the newspaper as a genteel, even pacifying form of media, but the advent of the printing press was followed by 150 years of religious war in Europe. Likewise, we think of the radio as a soothing presence, but it was the medium of fascism and communism, the medium that Hitler and Stalin used to impose control and murder millions. By contrast, the internet's disruptions have been sweeping, but so far, not bloody. But as we know, the internet age is wreaking its own kind of havoc. I'm just going to have a go, if I may, at listing the charges that are now leveled at the giants of Silicon Valley. Facilitation of hate speech and terrorism, enabling child pornography and paedophile rings, screen addiction, anxiety, inadequacy, online bullying, and chronic mental health problems, shielding criminality and corruption by defending encryption, and yet all the while plundering privacy by gathering personal data, fostering division through filter bubbles, stoking communalism, fueling polarization, destroying jobs, ranging from drivers to reporters to the many millions more to come, draining confidence that democracy can operate in the digital age, increasing political manipulation through psycho-profiling of users, hollowing out political debate by diminishing it to tweets and GIFs, damaging public discourse, avoiding billions in tax, thereby not helping to pay for the huge public policy problems they're creating, and concentrating fortunes in the hands of the few, while depriving jobs for many and investing in the artificial intelligence and robots that may eventually run all of our lives. I didn't have time this evening for the long list, I just went for the short one. And for some years now, I've been fascinated by the large and growing gap between the valley and the hill, between technology companies and the state. But I think when you consider that list, and when you listen to what's happening in our public spaces and in the corridors of political power, it seems to me that this is now changing. The techlash has begun. Politicians who until recently have feted the tech giants have started to turn. The media is, to a greater or lesser extent, on the warpath. Even the most senior people at companies like Facebook, Salesforce, Uber, and Alphabet, they'll tell you that a wave of regulation is coming. And my friend Benji Vaughan, who's the founder in London of a community platform service called Disciple Media, he says 2018 is a year when things change. He thinks 2018 will be the year of peak platform. Consumer concern, disruptive competitors, and political activism will all begin to pile on the pressure. So I'd like to consider how best to reset the relationship between digital media and society on just one of those fronts, as it concerns free speech. I'd like to point out that in the list that I gave, I didn't include fake news. I don't think that serious people should spend too much time worrying about fake news. And I certainly don't think we should spend too much time using the term. Fake news has a very specific meaning to my mind. It means publishing deliberately false stories in order to get eyeballs, either for financial gain or for political gain. So the classic, to my mind, is Pope endorses Donald Trump. It's the archetype. It's wrong, but it gets a huge amount of traffic. And I think that fake news, by that definition, is similar to spam. Spam in the early days of email. It's a wrinkle. It's a problem, but it is a fixable one. There are much more serious dangers, I believe, that lurk in the news itself. Junk news. News that's hurried, thin, deliberately shrill, lazily misleading. Or repetitive news. The swathes of coverage given to the same people, same stories, at the expense of the stories that go untold, the issues that go unreported, the ideas that go unexplored. Or just simply too much news, the simple volume of stuff that's coming at us every minute of the day. The result is that often the news industry, for all its effort and yes, truly excellent work, often it can't see the wood for the trees. And at the heart of the problem is that newsrooms themselves are samey. The people are similar. The business models are similar, if not the same. The service to customers is similar. Newsrooms still mostly operate like a concert, with someone playing to people sitting in an audience. But the internet means that news must much more resemble a music festival, where the performers and the people together make it. In short, we're going to need to open up. And just be clear, I'm well aware that we as journalists and journalistic institutions, we sometimes just get it wrong, right? We make mistakes. And it's also the case that we're often not told the whole truth. I remember many years ago walking through the newsroom of the Times and hearing our religion correspondent. She was a formidable figure and one who was getting extremely angry. And I remember hearing her on the phone saying, "But you told me you were going to Jerusalem. No, you told me you were going to Jerusalem, but you didn't go to Jerusalem. No, you didn't go to Jerusalem. You lied to me. And you're a bishop." So yes, one of the problems that we face is that people in all walks of life, including, as Ruth will tell you, occasionally a bishop, don't always tell you the truth. And then again, there's a different kind of problem, a different kind of problem in the news that we face. There's spin, or in its modern term, the great Kellyanne Conway's terminology, alternative facts. We see the problem, the distortion, the telling of true pieces of information that, cleverly assembled, disguise the full story, disguise the real story. And of course, there are examples of bias, covering what's happened, informed by a point of view, rather than the other way around. But I just want to make sure that we don't miss a story that is creeping up on us, an element of what's happening in the news, that to my mind is possibly more important and more worrying and more pervasive than all of these things. Because I think that the rather self-indulgent debate about fake news is missing a much, much bigger problem. It's the rise and rise of propaganda. I was in Russia not long after the US presidential election, and I went to the Kremlin. I saw Dmitry Peskov, Vladimir Putin's press secretary. I asked him what he thought of what was happening in the world of the media, and he said very breezily, "The world is in an information war." And frankly, that seems to me to be a more accurate but also more alarming way of understanding the problem we've got. Authoritarian regimes are pouring billions into cable TV networks, news websites and papers, and of course, their own digital platforms. If you look at last month's Freedom House numbers, they show how markedly democracy around the world is in retreat. And in large parts of the world, the problem of the information age is not too little state intervention, it's too much. There's in fact, I think, an oddly reinforcing dynamic at work. Authoritarian regimes are keeping technology and media companies on a tight leash. They're saying quite openly, we're doing this because we don't want the chaos. We don't want the information free-for-all of today's liberal democracies. Look at what's happening in the West. Meanwhile, those in the West are saying, we can't take on the tech companies. We can't interfere with the digital media space. They're appalled by the modern media totalitarianism that's on the rise in one-party states and the pseudo-democracies. Personally, I think we need to do more, much more, to stand up to the encroachment of a free, independent press by authoritarian regimes. In Myanmar, in Venezuela, in Russia and China, but also much closer to home, in Turkey, in Hungary. And I think it's the job of European journalists and governments, whether inside the European Union, outside it, or indeed leaving, it's the job of all of us to call out the erosion of a free press in countries that are members of the EU. Press freedom is one of the founding principles of the European Union. Its members should be fined or expelled if they do not uphold it. But what are we going to do about the problems that are more pervasive and, if you like, less clear-cut? What about the digital damage that is being done to faith in free speech in open societies? What should we do in our own democracies? The answer is that I don't know. I'm sorry to have come quite so far to tell you that I don't know the answer to this problem, but one of the things that strikes me about modern journalism is that we don't say often enough that we don't know. In fact, not knowing is the beginning of the great journalistic endeavor. And we live in this age where there's a tendency to overclaim. So I'd like to be honest and start by saying this is a really difficult problem, and I think it's going to need a lot of work. And I think that people, not just us journalists, but technologists, politicians, workers, parents, young people, we're all going to need to think these issues through together. Personally, my approach is to start thinking about it in three ways. The first is to rethink the incentives, the metrics for the big Silicon Valley companies. It's what I think of as step one. It's the softly, softly approach. We need to go to the tech companies and ask them to start measuring their outcomes. I've got to say I think it's in their interests to do this, because if they don't, heavier-handed regulation is coming their way. And frankly, if they don't, they're going to keep on being defined by others rather than themselves. Often the tech companies complain that their work, the digital contributions they're making to society, are not recognized in the GDP numbers. And they may well be right. But if we're going to change the behavior of some of the biggest companies in the world, the most constructive way of doing that is to reset their incentives. So what do I mean by that? What would public interest measurements for technology and digital media look like? I have in mind asking the tech companies to self-report at a far higher level of detail on the social impacts of their platforms and services, on cyberbullying, dissemination of hate speech, spread of violence, publication of sexual abuse, facilitation of corruption, data use for political campaigns, screen time by age, income, and geography. The platforms themselves should be collecting this information and making it public. As I see it, if we could do this, we could create a race for responsibility. It's easy to be cynical. It's easy and indeed fashionable to give the likes of Facebook a good kick-in. And after all, the model for platforms like Facebook has been the optimization of engagement. What a brilliant phrase. The optimization of engagement, which to you and me means get everyone on Facebook and keep them there. But last month, Facebook signaled what could be a really profound change, a move to optimize meaningful engagement. Right? Now, of course, this could just be a piece of political positioning. But I wouldn't underestimate Mark Zuckerberg. And when you listen to what he has to say, what their ambitions are for 2018, they do look markedly different. If Facebook is going to do more than get politicians and publishers off their backs, but rather get up and over the big issues, if they are going to start fixing journalism, online safety, the privatization of data, and the manipulation of politics, if they really went to work on those issues, well then, meaningful engagement could prove to be very meaningful indeed. That said, that is the softly, softly approach. There's a second approach, the one too that's coming. It's the one that we call regulation. And it's based on the assumption that better incentives will never be enough. The government will have to step in, either to break up the giants or to set the rules by which they operate. The politicians, from Berlin to Brussels, from London to Washington, are certainly limbering up to do both of those things. And we should be clear that it's risky. Regulators will often fix a problem of the past at the expense of the possibilities of the future. particularly when it comes to businesses they don't or can't, I say they don't, we don't or can't fully understand. And so as I see it in the technology sector, what we're beginning to see is a very fundamental change in the political environment. It looks to me very much like the financial services sector did 10, 20 years ago. Back then, if you remember, banks enjoyed a privileged position in politics. The vogue then was for, quote-unquote, light-touch regulation. Financial services banks were such generators of wealth, no politician wanted to really stop them setting up, stop them growing, stop them delivering to their exchequers, delivering tax. And intervention was deemed, in the banks was deemed to be self-defeating. After all, globalization was unstoppable. Today, those same arguments, those arguments about the generation of wealth, the certain fatalism, the expectation that these organizations are too complex and too big to stop. These stories, these arguments, you hear too about tech. And so for the last decade, possibly two, few politicians have wanted to wrestle with the Silicon Valley giants. But look now, that's changing. Regulation is coming to protect private data in Germany. In the UK, the government is just beginning to think about how to make technology platforms as liable for what they publish as media companies. And after all, they're increasingly looking like they're one and the same. And of course, you're seeing similar moves as these big companies start behaving more and more like banks themselves. The financial regulators are looking at where financial service rules apply to tech. This debate about regulation is, to my mind, well overdue. For too long, we've labored under some myths. One is that you can't regulate the internet because it's international, abundant, and fiendishly complex. Another is that politicians will be outfoxed by geeks. The technologists are just too smart for them. And a third is that the genie is out of the bottle, that Silicon Valley is too rich and too powerful to be tamed. This laissez-faire fatalism flies in the face of what we're seeing in China, Turkey, Russia. Let's not underestimate the power of the state. If it wants companies to behave in the public interest, it can. And indeed, it can go one further. It can create or help foster new kinds of public spaces on the internet. It can support its own interventions. And this is the third approach I'd like to just touch on. In 1922, the BBC was created, in no small part because the British government feared the prospect of a technology as powerful as broadcasting being controlled by newspaper barons. With a motto that nation shall speak peace unto nation and a mission to inform, educate and entertain, the BBC has created the template for public service broadcasting. It has always aspired to quality, to give the best of everything to everyone. And unlike some of its cousins in Europe, its funding model has always been separate from the tax system, and its independence has been fiercely guarded. It serves the public, not the government. It answers to its audiences, not the politicians. And today, the UK is, in my view, extremely lucky to have a BBC that creates a public space in the digital world that is defined by those same public purposes: responsible journalism, distinctive entertainment, lifelong learning, and a shared experience of the great moments in national life. In my view, we are going to need more, not less, of this in the internet age. It's the next generation, if you like, of public service broadcasting. Let's call it public service networking. Places that are safe for children. Services that guarantee that our data is safe from political or commercial exploitation. Room to share ideas, learn new skills. Places that reinforce a sense of community. Town squares where the debate is civil, accurate, and I say again, independent. If the BBC had never been created, then today we would be standing here and discussing the invention of the BDC, the British Digital Corporation, to deliver to make public those ends by digital means. In the UK, my view is that more resources, therefore, not less, should be made available to the BBC to do just this. There was a time a few years ago when politicians suggested that the BBC had overreached online, up against Facebook, Google, Netflix, and Apple. To my mind, the risk is that public service providers like the BBC end up with an impoverished offering, not imperial ambition. And if people want public spaces that are safe, there are two ways that public service networking can happen. Either governments can introduce license fees or tech levies to fund free expression in the internet, or the giants themselves will set aside substantial funds to create such public spaces with clear social purposes and solid independence guarantees. These problems are not easy ones, as I said. And one of the things I've come to recognize about us as a group, we journalists, is that among our many foibles, among our many shortcomings, one of them is that we prefer stories that we understand but aren't important to ones that we don't understand but are. And I'd just like to point to a particular story, one that's unfolding right now, that seems to me to exemplify the complexity but also the urgency of the problem we've got. In 1984, in fact, not so many months after that Apple computer ad first aired, Pavel Durov was born in Leningrad. And today, Pavel Durov is at the center of an amazing story. A story that is, in many ways, indecipherable. It is, to my mind, a modern morality tale. One that, on the one hand, promises safe, free expression to the repressed in autocratic societies, and yet at the same time, a great weakening of democratic countries' ability to police criminals and sanction rogue states. As many of you will know, Mr. Durov created a Russian equivalent of Facebook, VKontakte, only to have it taken off his hands by, let's call them the friends of Mr. Putin. He moved to Dubai and he set up an encrypted messaging service called Telegram. Telegram, many of you will know, is now the communications medium of choice for tens of millions of Iranians who, without it, wouldn't feel safe speaking their minds. Now, Mr. Durov is planning an ICO, an initial coin offering. What he wants to do is see tech investors, as they surely are, race to sign up to buy his cryptocurrency. So what happens next? We're going to see an encrypted messaging service matched with an anonymous currency. In effect, a marketplace where kidnappers and drug dealers, rogue states and corrupt companies will be able to operate out of sight and beyond the reach of the law. My point, ladies and gentlemen, is that these are complicated problems, very complicated. But they also pose a profound challenge to those of us who are the champions of freedom of expression. If we're not careful, those of us who prize those liberties most keenly, those of us who believe in the freedom of expression, will find ourselves used as fig leaves for laissez-faire non-intervention, as these technology companies accrue wealth, power, and a slew of really big public policy problems to their names. We're going to need to find new ways to bridge the gaps between the valley and the hill, between technology and government. The happy news is that we are not powerless, and particularly you, journalists, are not powerless to fix this. In fact, I think that this is one of the essential purposes of journalism in the 21st century. If you go and see the film The Post, or you've seen Spotlight, or you remember watching All the President's Men, it's very easy to be nostalgic. It's very easy to think, oh, those were the days. Not least smoking in the office. Those were the days. But go and watch those movies again. Because those days are now. The powerful exist in many more guises than just government. The big five forces reshaping our times: technology, longevity, globalization, identity, and the environment. These big five forces require journalists to reveal what's being done to us, and quite often what's being done in our name. And today, you, the coming generation of writers and editors, radio reporters and filmmakers, data scientists and designers, the citizens born in the internet age, you have the means to organize for change. You have the networks to find out the truth. And you have the ability to do the journalism that informs a future that works for us. To coin a phrase, good night and good luck. Thank you very much.